What do I need to prove to be successful in a medical malpractice case?
Well, to prevail in a medical malpractice case against a physician, the plaintiff or patient must prove four distinct elements: duty, a breach of a duty, proximate cause, and damages. And if any one of those essential elements is missing, the plaintiff will not prevail. And it's the plaintiff who has the burden of proof in these cases. Duty actually refers to the legal relationship between the plaintiff and defendant. In a medical malpractice case, the duty requires that the healthcare provider delivers healthcare in accordance with the standard of care. So a relationship must exist before the duty arises. Once there's that physician-patient relationship, the defendant doctor becomes legally accountable for his or her actions. The second element is breach of duty. Once the expert establishes the standard of care, the plaintiff must also show that there's been a breach of that duty. And a breach of the duty can be either an act or an omission. Another important element is proximate cause or causation. There must be a direct relationship between the alleged negligence and the plaintiff's injuries. No defendant will be found liable for injuries to the plaintiff simply because the defendant performed negligently. There has to be that causal connection. And the final element is damages. The plaintiff must prove that they have sustained an injury or damage. And in Illinois, damages fall into two basic categories. The first category is economic damage, and the second is non-economic damage. And some of the elements that a plaintiff may be compensated for include past and future medical care costs, lost earnings, past and future pain and suffering, past and future disability, disfigurement. So an example of an economic damage would be lost wages or past medical bills. An example of a non-economic damage would be pain and suffering.